Welcome back to another episode of Point B, a Sibros podcast where we interview industry experts about the latest innovations and trends in automotive technology and the connected vehicle industry. Tune in to learn about topics ranging from the next generation of electric vehicles to advances in connectivity and micromobility.
Welcome to our Point B podcast, where we discuss the future of mobility and transportation products and services. My name is Steve Schwinke, Vice President of Customer Engagement at Sibros, and today I have Brian Carlson, Director of Global Product and Solutions Marketing at NXP Semiconductors. And today we're going to talk about the evolution, or really is it the revolution, of mobility products and their electrical architectures. But let me first start by introducing Brian. At NXP, he has the responsibility for global marketing of automotive processors and solutions that can transform vehicles and create new business opportunities. And he also has 30 years of experience growing semiconductor, software, and system businesses, and has been recognized with several industry awards and is widely published. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, great, Steve. Great to be here and talk to you about SDVs.
Let's start with the big shift that's taking place in vehicle architectures in the automotive industry today. Can you kind of just summarize what this shift looks like?
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing a big shift across. This is a global effort of OEMs around the world, and it's really driven by the complexity of vehicles today, which traditionally have been hardware driven or hardware defined with ECUs or electronic control units. And really what's happening is that is not scaling going further. Instead of adding a new box to add a new feature to a vehicle, it's moving more towards a software-defined vehicle, which is based on new types of architectures, whether there's domain or zonal or a combination of those. It's really about simplifying the vehicle architecture and enabling the future, which allows software to define it rather than boxes. The big issue with boxes is with every box comes wires and cables. And what we're seeing is that these cable harnesses are becoming very thick, 2 or 3 inches, even impacting the manufacturing of vehicles, the reliability over time. It's just not a scalable future. So really that's what's happening. It's this big shift over into these new vehicle EE architectures, whether it's domain, zonal, or a hybrid of the two.
You talked a little bit about wiring, but there's other forces at hand, right?
Yeah, that's the first motivation where it all kind of started. And then there's been this parallel universe, I would say, the software side of things, where the world is becoming more dynamic, right? It's more software oriented. And so on top of this, the industry wants to be able to deploy, much like in the mobile industry, to deploy new services, over-the-air updates, to be able to make that vehicle more dynamic, improvement over time. And what that does is drive the need for a new approach. Instead of being a captive microcontroller within a box or an ECU that does one function, that's all it does. It can't really be updated in many cases. The future is moving towards this software-defined world where easily I can add new capabilities, I can add new features, I can improve the capabilities of my car, and that requires a totally new way of doing things. It requires new software, new hardware, new architecture, which we started talking about, and really all of that has to happen at the same time. And I like to compare it to the industry's going through brain surgery and heart surgery at the same time, and it's massive. It has a lot of implications, but at the end of the day, it's about simplifying the wiring, as I talked about, but it's also about enabling this whole new software-defined world and the opportunities and new capabilities and services that will bring to the industry and to consumers.
So these changes, are they happening all at once? Like, it goes back to this question of, is this an evolution or a revolution?
I would say overall this is where the industry is moving. Now, where it may differ is OEM by OEM or car manufacturer, because they do take a little bit of different approaches over time. Some may move quicker than others. Some may move directly into the zonal architecture, which is about putting functionality at the edges of the vehicle with a vehicle computer in the center, while some may move more to domain architectures, which is about putting logical functions together in a consistent box or a domain controller. So it really differs between the OEM. But it is a global phenomenon. And over time, I think by 2030, they're all moving towards the zonal architectures for implementation of software-defined vehicle. But I think there will be this evolution as part of the overall revolution at the end of the day.
We see a lot of new entrants into the mobility space, right? We see the barriers to entry, especially around EVs, where the powertrain propulsion systems are much more complex. Are they the ones leading the charge, or is it the traditional OEMs?
You bring a good point up, because the new entrants, maybe the disruptors or the companies that are coming, I would say more from a clean slate, right? They don't have all the legacy. So definitely, I believe that does give an advantage, both in the mindset of how they approach it without having to try to factor in, how do I still leverage some of my legacy approaches or legacy boxes within this new architecture? But I think overall, whether it's the disruptors, the new startups, whether it's from California, whether it's from China, right? We see those hotspots of new innovations coming, and that they can move faster because they're coming from that clean slate. I think we're still seeing the legacy OEMs worldwide moving pretty quickly themselves. So I think both of them are taking advantage of the new processing and software capabilities and bringing those together with these new architectures and software-defined vehicles. But you're right, disruptors, they don't have to deal with so much of the legacy capabilities or boxes. Now, at the same time, as part of those legacy OEMs, they have to transition their workforce, how they work together, because typically they've been organized by functions, right? Whether I'm a powertrain person or I'm an infotainment person or body. That is part of that challenge from moving from a legacy world, which is more by boxes and by those functions, to this world where it's all converging or consolidating functions in these types of vehicle computers or zones or domain controllers. So that is an additional challenge for the OEMs, but we do see them picking up and accepting that challenge and moving very quickly and putting a lot of money into this transformation, really a digital transformation of automotive.
So it's a shift really at the OEMs, but it's also a shift, let's say, with the tier one suppliers. Are you seeing that some of these tier one suppliers that provided those boxes before in the past now have to work together on a common platform, and how's that working out?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a lot of dynamics. I was just talking about kind of the impact to the OEM, but definitely from a tier one perspective, the old model has been the OEM defines what they want, the tier ones bid and ultimately would provide a box that gets integrated by the OEM. Well, that whole scenario has really changed, where the OEMs are taking more control, especially in these architectures, right? The OEMs are taking the lead in the architectures, and sometimes some help and consultant and working some proof of concepts with the tier ones. But the tier ones role is definitely changing. And if you look at the tier ones, they've been acquiring software companies. They've been doing more overall looking at SDV and trying to integrate some of the new technologies to stay ahead of the curve and to continue to provide that value. But at the end of the day, the OEMs are really driving this. They're working directly with the silicon providers like NXP to drive where they want to go in the future with the silicon that they need. And in that process, the tier ones are reinventing themselves to become more software savvy, to provide more capabilities in the software area. And that really is important in the software-defined era, because you can imagine, instead of providing a box, an ECU, you could provide a virtual ECU, which is software, right? And software that is integrated within the overall vehicle computer or within a zone. And in that box, you may have multiple tier ones that are running on the same chip. And that's an area that we're excited about, because we're providing new technology that enables multiple tier ones or ecosystem partners or the OEM themselves to actually run on the same chip within these more consolidated boxes that we see going forward.
Fascinating stuff. And I want to drill down deeper into what this means to the silicon providers like NXP. So what are some of these shifts? What are the challenges that you face when providing the silicon?
This is why that our new silicon is really designed for software-defined vehicle. And what that means is instead of the old world, as I talked about, which is more just a microcontroller running one dedicated function from one tier one or the OEM itself, it's really moved to multiple, or I call multi-tenant. Think of it like an apartment complex, a multi-tenant where it's one building, but they each have their own apartment within the building, and they have their own access and their own keys, and they can't just freely go to the other tenants. And really, it's that concept that we have to do in the new silicon for these software-defined vehicles that consolidate functions from multiple companies. There's two sides of that. There's the actual IP issue, because IP is a concern. You don't want one company's software to have to be accessible by a competitor. So there's this whole IP issue. So isolation and separation is really, really critical within the chip. The other time is about execution, especially in these multi-tenant environments. They can't interfere with each other. So if one is operating doing its function and the other one is doing its function, they cannot impact the execution or the determinism of the other one. And that requires hardware assistance to ensure quality of service and resource allocation and isolation, true isolation. In our case, on the S32Z and E, some of our processors we announced, it actually isolates from the processor to the peripherals, to the memory, and all the way out to the I/O pins. I like to say core to I/O isolation. And what's great about that is it brings back that old model in a way that the tier one or the person developing that ECU is within their own environment and they can't impact others. But now it's actually on a single chip.
Interesting on the IP protection. What about security?
Definitely, we talk about isolation more from a functional and IP point of view, but security is fundamental. And security is not something that you can just add later. Security has to be baked in. It has to be part of the whole process, and that starts with the chip itself. And so we've gone through that process with our development of our silicon to go through the ISO 21434 certification on how we do our security. But if you look at the whole automobile and all the way to the cloud, right, it has to have end-to-end security, because security is only good as its weakest link. There's been a big, I would say, change in security in automotive, especially since the 2015 or so types of hacks that exposed the vulnerabilities of traditional automotive silicon. And since then, there's been a lot of emphasis put on moving to more secure cryptography and authentication, leveraging asymmetric cryptography and public key infrastructure. I mean, that's what's used in banking and other transactions today that are secure. So we're bringing that technology in, especially from NXP's perspective. We're in bank cards, smart cards, and e-passports. So we brought that technology into the device to ensure that within the device, the security services are there for all of those tenants that are in the chip, and they have full access to all the cryptography and authentication, and can be used to communicate with the cloud and to provide secure services within it.
We saw a lot with secure gateways. You're right, about 6 or 7 years ago, starting to come into, I'll call it the traditional architectures that OEMs are running. And a lot of them today are still running these secure gateways, running the S32G. Will that continue? That approach to security is to make sure that there's a little bit of isolation between, I'll say, the connected side and the core part of the vehicle?
Yeah, definitely. It's been interesting, that whole journey from, I would say, we were doing gateways 15, 20 years ago, and they're very basic, right? And the whole thing about a gateway is, how do I move data from one part of the vehicle, which may be CAN, to another part of the vehicle that's using LIN or Ethernet? And how do I do that securely so that that data is secure through the whole path within the vehicle? And now, with these connected vehicles, how do I make sure that the data is secure all the way to the cloud? Now, what we've seen is an actual evolution, because those are fairly simple types of devices with a microcontroller. As we introduced the S32G, which those gateways became more service-oriented gateways with more complete security and the ability to run services. It's almost like the precursor to this whole SDV. These service-oriented gateways are becoming more and more performance oriented. We just announced the S32G3, which is a big uplift, about 2.5 times the performance and memory and networking. And so what's happening is the service-oriented gateway is now evolving into a vehicle computer. So you may hear that central vehicle computer. It basically is the brain of the vehicle, which is independent from the infotainment and from the ADAS functionality. Typically, it's the master of controlling everything in the vehicle. And that's really where we see this happening, is that security and functionality of gateway, and then adding services and more consolidation. That vehicle computer now becomes the central place where all of this is located, and really it controls what a vehicle is.
Brian, I want to thank you for joining us on Point B. I think we could keep talking for a few more hours on this subject, but we'll keep it here, and we'll look forward to having you back on our next episode.
Great speaking to you. And definitely, this is a topic that we could talk to for hours. So thanks for the opportunity to be on your podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to Point B. Join us next time for more auto tech innovations and trends. Point B is brought to you by Sibros.